The Great Seer Nostradamus Tells All by William P. Lazarus. Chapter 2, Episode 1. Jew, Jew! A young teen cried and waved his wooden sword at Nostradamus, who quickly jumped aside. "Take it back," he demanded. "Francis, take it back. I am not a Jew." Francis just laughed and pressed on. The tip of the sword had been sharpened. Nostradamus could see it flicking at him like a flame suddenly shot from one of his grandfather's furnaces. His opponent was older, perhaps 11, and more determined. His dark face was lit up with a smug smile. Never overly athletic, Nostradamus could barely keep his footing as his bare feet slipped on cobblestones dampened by an early morning rain. He sidestepped another clumsy thrust. The blade was closer this time and brushed his blouse. His jaunty hat fell off. Francis speared it with glee and rammed it into a small mud puddle, laughing maniacally at the result. "Give me that," Nostradamus cried and jumped at his foe. His thin frame collided against Francis' thicker body, and the momentum drove them both to the ground. They rolled over in the mud, collecting bits of garbage on their clothes and adding dirt stains to those caused by perspiration. Nostradamus reached blindly for the hat, his vision obscured by Francis' clothing. They struggled on, rolling, yelling, kicking. A small, youthful crowd gathered, shouting encouragement, making small bets on the outcome and prodding the combatants with wooden staves when needed. Francis got to his feet first. Panting heavily, his clothes freckled with shreds of fat, tattered rags and dung, he glared at Nostradamus. "Get up, Jew," he demanded. "It's time to be circumcised." He thrust the sword toward Nostradamus' groin. The lad tried to step aside, fell across a dining pig, and slid into another small pile of rubbish. He fought his way through the trash, blindly flinging handfuls at Francis, all the while insisting he was Catholic. "Marano," Francis taunted as he dodged fetid missiles. "Portuguese merchant." Nostradamus sat up. "Huh," he said, wiping something rancid from his face. The anger dissipated in confusion. "I'm not a merchant." "Jesu, you're stupid too," Francis sneered. "You don't even know what a Portuguese merchant is." Several in the small crowd laughed, but a few in the back began to drift away as the hubbub died down. A housewife, chasing a barking dog through drying clothing, quickly became more appealing. "A Portuguese merchant is a Jew who converted to Christianity under force and practices his true religion secretly," said a quiet voice. Still seated, Nostradamus turned to see who was talking now. More dirt fell from his black, stringy hair and showered his face. He wiped at it with a foul-smelling sleeve and then could see a tall youth standing nonchalantly a few feet away. He was dressed in a striped, multicolored silk blouse with his light-colored hair topped by a spirited hat graced by a feather. He wore 2 stylish white gloves, unmarked and crisp. His stockings were clean, his shoes soft leather and nicely pointed. Too young to shave, he nevertheless had the face of an older man filled with hard self-assurance. Nostradamus could see the young man's bright blue and sparkly eyes. They glistened with intelligence and grace. The lad had seen a lot and stored the information in those eyes. Nostradamus felt drawn to them almost against his will. Even Francis' sword fall into his side seemed mesmerized. "Who are you?" Nostradamus managed. "Ernest de Novo," said the youth, bowing low and doffing his hat. He spoke in French. Still, there was a strong hint of a foreign accent in his clear tone. "How do you know what a Portuguese merchant is?" Francis demanded, shaking off the newcomer's spell. "You a Jew too? We are all what we were born to be," Ernest said calmly. "You cannot change your parentage. The only thing you can hope to improve is your bad manners or your aim. In your case, however, I suspect both are beyond your capabilities." With that, he removed a leather glove, bent over and offered his left hand to Nostradamus. Francis seized the moment to rush forward and thrust his sword at the newcomer's exposed rear. Ernest moved swiftly, knocking the sword aside with a firm right arm and then turning to face his assailant. The sword flew in an ungainly arc, before impaling itself in dung heaps left by several pigs shaken by the human fracas. All 3 youngsters stared at the sword. Ernest reacted first, quietly retrieving it, wiping its tip on the ground and then suddenly breaking it into 2 pieces across his knee. "Would you like it back now, sir?" he asked. "Or should I do the same thing to you?" Francis hesitated. "Damned Jew!" he shouted and sprinted down the street. He scurried around someone selling candles, colliding with a rag salesman's pushcart, much to the dismay of all involved, and then disappeared around a corner. "Thank you," Nostradamus said as he stood up and brushed himself off. The disappointed remnant of the crowd moved on. Nostradamus rescued his sodden hat, but ruefully decided it would never grace his head again. Mashed and battered, it featured a large gash that had allowed much of its charm to ooze away. Still, it had carried such pleasant daydreams, and the young Nostradamus was reluctant to part with it. He wrung out the water, brushed away some of the dirt. It was hard not to cry. A boy growing up in Saint-Rémy had little chance of seeing the court in distant Paris or ever spotting even a minor official. Messengers and criers were rare. Before the fight, with that plumed hat on his head, he could pretend to greet visiting royalty, host glamorous maidens arrested by his style and savoir-faire, awe brave knights who would insist on him joining their ranks. In its present condition, the hat could no longer bear such inspiration. Ernest smiled. He seemed to sense the emotions involved in the moment. He tenderly brushed the hair away from Nostradamus' face. "Pretty," he said absently. "How old are you?" "9, and not a Jew," Nostradamus said firmly. "Saints be praised," Ernest said. "I mean your name. Where do you live?" "My name is Mitchell de Nostradamus. I live here in Saint-Rémy. My father is a notary. My grandfather Jean is an astrologer and an alchemist. I am learning from him." Ernest seemed lost in thought for a moment. "I'd like to meet your grandfather," he said. "I am traveling the country in search of promising young men to train with my master. You must know of him, Leonardo da Vinci." He said that name with pride as if the name would overawe all who heard it. Nostradamus thought a moment, trying to appear learned and impressed, then surrendered to the inevitable and shook his head. The name was Italian. There were many merchants who journeyed through Provence, located on the rim of a southern France that rested on the crest of Savoy and then into Italy. Perhaps Leonardo was one of them. He must be wealthy to afford such a fancy dresser as Ernest for his assistant. "Never mind," Ernest said with a laugh. "You will meet him soon enough. And you, my grandfather," countered Nostradamus, promptly leading Ernest down several narrow streets cluttered with carts, animals, and people. The church bells already had sounded to mark the 11th hour, a time when everyone should be doing something worthwhile. A few French soldiers, straggling back from the fighting in Italy, were sitting on a corner, munching bread and cheese. Dressed still in leather breastplates, they reeked of sweat and exertion. Their worn, battered sandals bore testimony to the miles they had covered. With hair hanging down in sopped ringlets over their faces, they ate in silence and ignored the people around them. A barber approached, wondering if any wounds needed tending, but they waved him away. A boy, carrying some vial for the apothecary Malin, stood for a moment and watched them in awed silence, as did Nostradamus before both remembered their errands. Other boys, with nothing to do, fought boredom by imitating the soldiers and then beginning their own miniature wars. French warriors against Papal or League dragoons. Older women, on their way to wash clothes or carrying jars of olive oil or water, clucked something at a younger woman, who, smiling coyly, had stopped near the soldiers. There were few young people around, except those in monks' robes with small tongers on the backs of their heads. The wars in Italy had drained away many adventurous youths. Farmers and serfs were at work, businessmen and traders were counting money in their stores. Few young men were left to parade through the streets. That alone made Ernest unusual. His manner completed the effect. Unabashed and unconcerned, he marched along without a second glance. Nostradamus could see how most of the passers-by started at the haughty young man with his perfumed handkerchief poking out a sleeve and the ruffled lace collar. A few stopped and gawked, but most glanced surreptitiously and then began whispering to a neighbor. Nostradamus straightened, feeling very important, as though his companion's elegant presence smoothed out his own wrinkled clothes and erased their rancid odor. He began to strut a little, keeping his long nose tilted regally towards the blue sky. As a result, he nearly tripped over an old woman who had seated herself in a shady corner and was gazing, gap-toothed, at nothing through nearly sightless eyes. Nostradamus quickly apologized and hurried after Ernest, who sidestepped every obstacle with deft grace, avoiding puddles of muck and urine. He was hurrying in a princely manner, although he could not know exactly where he was going. Pointedly and with a slight flourish, Nostradamus directed Ernest toward a side street and then knocked on a closed wooden door. The sound echoed for a moment as though the interior was hollow. "Come," a voice rasped from within. Nostradamus opened the door and bowed slightly. "Please enter, sir," he said. "My grandfather awaits." The door opened on a bright yet somber room. Ernest did not hesitate to step inside. Nostradamus noticed that lack of concern immediately. His friends shunned this laboratory, even his own father hesitated at the threshold. Ernest vaulted inside as though he visited many alchemists and thought nothing of the exercise. Their eyes adjusted quickly to the bright lighting. The room was small but hot, with 3 lit furnaces built into the brick walls in separate sides. A long workbench covered with burning candles ran along the left wall. It was covered with vials, fire clay crucibles, metal mortars, glass flasks, all seemingly scattered at random. Several retorts with long glass necks were already filled with liquids. On another table were furnace rakes, iron tongs for handling the fired containers, funnels, and strainers. Amid this overheated room, like a dark devil tending the fires of hell, was a small, bent man with white hair. Dressed in a black scholar's robe despite the warmth, he had his back to the door and was using tongs to turn a white-hot clay vessel roasting above the licking red flames of one furnace. He did not bother to greet them. Instead, grandfather finished his task and went back to his bench with a clay vessel securely gripped in his tongs. There he carefully pried open a container. Egg-shaped, it cracked slightly as he edged a sliver of metal into the seal. Then, suddenly, it burst with a bang. Steam billowed out. The old man bent over the pot and used his metal rod to stir the boiling liquid inside. A grim smile marred his reddened face. He drew up a drop of liquid from the clay vessel on the tip of the metal, shifting slightly to examine it in the uneven light from the fire inside the furnace. Apparently satisfied, he returned the metal rod to the table. Nodding to himself and saying something indiscernible, he resealed the vessel. Tongs in gloved hands, his fingers poking through the tips of the ragged cloth, he thrust the vessel back into the nearest furnace. Hit the subscribe button and share this story with other book lovers before moving to Chapter 2, Episode 2, up next.